Zelda was born as the youngest daughter of Alabama Supreme Court Justice Anthony Dickinshire and Minnie Buckner Machenshire. Apparently, she was named after the tragic heroine of a novel, which seems very fitting as we go through her life story together. She grew up in Montgomery, which was a deeply conservative, racially segregated southern capital. Her family was placed near the top of the social hierarchy in Montgomery due to her father being a prominent judge. So she did enjoy a childhood in the upper middle class, governed by strict expectations for white Southern girls and supported by black domestic labor, which was unquestioned at the time. Her home was filled with maids, cooks, and household workers who took care of the family. Her father was strict, proper, and status conscious, while her mother was a bit more playful, emotional, and indulgent. Even as a child, Zelda was confident and always in motion. While she was expected to behave properly, whatever that means, she did love attention, and she quickly learned that the attention came from being shocking, charming, and excessive. As a teenager, she would slip out at night to swim in the Alabama River. There are stories of her that she would wear a nude-colored bathing suit, which would basically make her look naked, which was considered deeply improper, so it was sure to get her attention. She was famous around town, even so that the newspaper would describe her as only caring about boys and swimming. As a teenager, Zelda danced constantly, flirted openly, and moved through social spaces like she owned them. And we also have to talk about the obvious thing. Zelda was able to do this in the conservative South because she came from a wealthy white household. She could push against gender limits without ever seriously endangering her physical safety. If she would have been any other skin color, she wouldn't have been able to do any of this without being in serious danger. While she pushed against the patriarchy, she lived comfortably in white supremacy. Even in her youth, she displayed signs of anxiety, insomnia, and extreme mood swings. While she raced through ideas, letters, and dances, she could go days without sleep. Friends recalled her shifting rapidly between joy and despair. In her diary, she would channel her creative side. Later, some of those excerpts would be released. Zelda had overflowing energy. She danced in public, drank alcohol, and flirted aggressively. She loved the attention and knew how to command it. She once said that she loved men best when they were in love with her, a clear sign that she already understood something about power, even in her early years. In company, she could sparkle while struggling when being alone. So even from the young years, her intensity is already visible, the pull between strong emotions. Later in life, she described herself feeling trapped between wanting attention and wanting freedom. Zelda met F. Scott Fitzgerald in July 1918 in Montgomery. He was 21, a second lieutenant stationed at the nearby Camp Sheridan, waiting to be shipped overseas. Zelda was 18 at the time, already famous around town for being beautiful, unruly, and impossible to control. They met at the country club, and this meeting would later be Scott's inspiration for the characters Jay and Daisy meeting in The Great Gatsby. Scott was immediately taken by her, falling in love almost instantly. He wrote her letters obsessively. While Zelda was flattered by this, she also saw his insecurities and dependence. After Scott left the army and moved north to become a writer, the imbalance between them became pretty obvious. He was living in cheap rooms, working in advertising, and failing to tell stories. Back in Montgomery, Zelda was surrounded by wealth, family pressure, and other suitors. In a letter Scott wrote to a friend, he said, "I love her, and that's the beginning and end of everything. You're still a Catholic, but Zelda's the only god I have left now. She did like to tease him, writing that she would not marry a man who wouldn't meet her own standards of energy and brilliance. So from the beginning, they had a push and pull dynamic, an intense desire mixed with playful rebellion and competition. Scott did not intend to marry her because he was struggling financially, but one day Zelda opened a letter from him, which did contain an engagement ring. She accepted it, but soon would call off this engagement, writing that she did love him, but could not marry a man without stability or money. Scott was devastated by this. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I wouldn't care if she dies, but I couldn't stand to have anybody else marry her." He poured all this energy into rewriting the novel This Side of Paradise, Zelda being his muse and pressure point. When the book was accepted by Scribners in late 1919, Scott wired Zelda immediately. The message was essentially, "I have made it. Now you can marry me." He promised to bring her to New York with all the iridescence of the beginning of the world. Their formal engagement resumed after Scott's success was guaranteed. Within days of the novel's publication in March 1920, they were married. Almost a little bit too fast, as if stopping to reflect might undo the spell. So their engagement wasn't purely romantic, but also strategic, conditional, and emotionally charged. After the success of This Side of Paradise, they enjoyed their new life and fame, quickly moving into the social circus of the Jazz Age. Their days were filled with parties, dancing, and gambling. But apparently both of them were quickly unhappy with the marriage. It seemed that Scott was still kind of in love with his first love, or at least clung to his feelings for her, Ginevra King, a relationship which failed due to his financial struggles. Rumors has it that he was attracted to Zelda because she reminded him of his first love. But still, they lived wildly and fully, jumping fully dressed into fountains, dancing on tabletops, and riding on the hood of cabs. Just as they lived theatrically, so were their fights. After a drunken argument, Zelda locked him out of the hotel room they lived in. Scott slept in the hall, and in the morning, of course, she pretended like nothing had happened at all. In 1921, Zelda became pregnant and gave birth to Frances Scotty Fitzgerald. One of the first things she said after giving birth was, "I hope it's a fool, a beautiful little fool," which soon were also words being given to the character Daisy in The Great Gatsby. Since they made homes out of different hotels, which they also got evicted out of a lot, they decided to move to a cottage in Connecticut. Due to Zelda's privileged upbringing, being surrounded by housekeepers who did all the chores, she had no idea how to run her own household. Scott realized that all his dirty clothes kept disappearing and were magically found in the closet, where Zelda just threw them into instead of washing them. It was obvious that the relationship between the two of them grew more strained, and to regain some sense of autonomy, Zelda started writing more. Her writing would sometimes appear in magazines, being described as witty and ironic. Scott often edited them, reinforcing the idea that her writing wasn't purely independent. But this wasn't just a thought that grew from Scott involving himself into her creative outlet. She was annoyed by the fact that he took a lot of inspiration from her person and her writing. For example, for his novel, The Beautiful and the Damned, he took a lot of inspiration from her diary and letters. He formed the characters Anthony Patch after himself and Gloria Patch after Zelda, with her chill-mindedness and selfishness. She was quoted saying, "Plagiarism begins at home," and saying that he did not love her, but what he could write from her. In 1924, the family lived in France. Scott drank heavily and worked obsessively. He treated Zelda both as his muse and property, putting even more strain on the relationship. Enter the scene Edouard Chausson, a young French naval aviator and artist. While Scott worked on The Great Gatsby, Zelda spent her time going to the beach and practicing her French with the naval pilots from the nearby base. As soon as she laid her eyes on Chausson, she was immediately attracted to him. They started spending time together, growing really close. And just 5 weeks later, she confessed her feelings for Chausson to Scott and asked him for a divorce. And as you can imagine, Scott did not take this lightly. He confronted the man, who fled town after the confrontation. He had no intention to marry Zelda or take the relationship any further. After this incident, Zelda grew extremely unstable. She even possibly tried to take her own life with sleeping pills. In 1925, they returned to Paris, where they met Hemingway. It quickly became apparent that Scott idolized him, while Zelda wasn't so fond of him, and vice versa. Hemingway was quoted saying, "She distracts Scott from his work, drains him emotionally, encourages his drinking and chaotic ways." She was really wary of their relationship, accusing them of having an affair, and even calling Scott homophobic names during public outings. She also mocked Hemingway for his toughness, saying it masked deep insecurities. Dancing was something Zelda loved since being young, so it doesn't seem random that she decided to pursue a career in ballet. What makes the whole thing concerning is that she went into this decision with signs of mania. She sometimes studied up for 8 hours a day. And I know that a lot of dancers put that much time into that practice, but at this point she was already at an age where most dancers are at the end of their career. The intensity, late start, and refusal to quit would quickly lead to her body breaking down, suffering from exhaustion, injuries, and chronic pain. The pressure would also be visible in her mental health. She suffered her first major breakdown. Her mental health would further deteriorate. One day, she tried to seize the steering wheel of a moving car, trying to drive herself, Scott, and 9-year-old Scotty over a cliff. This incident led to her being hospitalized into different psychiatric facilities, getting diagnosed with schizophrenia. Later, experts would say that it was probably bipolar disorder instead of schizophrenia. Scott hired nurses to take care of her, since she was a danger not only to herself but also to others. In September 1931, Zelda's father passed away, which obviously hit her very hard. Losing him left her even more emotionally exposed at a time when she was already vulnerable. It removed one of the last emotional anchors in her life. After her father's death, Zelda and Scott grew increasingly distant. His career declined, and he often blamed Zelda's illness for his failures. Meanwhile, she felt controlled and silenced by not only her husband, but also the doctors and society's expectations of women. They were separated for long periods of time, since Zelda stayed in different facilities in Switzerland, France, and later the United States. Trying to reclaim parts of herself, and also as a part of her recovery, she spent at least 2 hours a day writing a manuscript. Her semi-autobiographical book, Save Me the Waltz. The story follows Alabama Banks as Zelda and David Knight as Scott, a Southern girl married to a brilliant man, covering her erasure in his success and the attempt to claim herself through ballet and the physical and emotional cost of that attempt. With the same intensity and obsessiveness she moved through most of her life, she finished the book in about 6 weeks. After finishing it, she sent it directly to Maxwell Perkins, Scott's editor at Scribner's, and her husband was furious with this decision, accusing her of stealing material he needed for his novel, Tender as the Night. Scott argued that their life was shared property, but in practice, only he had ever been allowed to profit from it. Demanding revisions, he cut out sections and insisted on changes that softened his fictional counterpart and altered key scenes. When it was published in 1932, the story was heavily edited. The sales were poor, which left Zelda feeling hurt and humiliated. Writing this book had been such a personal act of survival for her. She believed that critics weren't judging the book fairly. They were judging her as a mentally ill woman and as a famous man's wife. The book was often described as chaotic, overly emotional, and a lot of them also framed it in comparison to Scott's writing, which just immediately put her at a disadvantage. When Tender as the Night was released, it covered much of the same emotional ground, and to no one's surprise, it did get a lot of praise. Zelda kept declining. There are instances where she threw herself out of a moving car or hit her tennis partner over the head with a tennis racket after losing the game. But despite her struggles, she continued her artistic ambitions. She attempted to write a stage play called Scandalabra, which Broadway producers rejected. After this rejection, Scott staged a small theater group and sat through long hours of the play. It was a comedy that poked fun at fame, scandal, and modern marriage, very much drawn from her own life in the public eye. It opened in New York but closed only after a few weeks. Reviews were mostly negative or confused. Critics often called it messy, unfocused, or frivolous. After the failure of her novel and Broadway play, visual arts became her main creative outlet. Having already painted at different stages in her life, she began painting seriously during her hospitalizations. Unlike writing, painting didn't cause the same conflicts with Scott or accusations that she was stealing material. It was a way of expressing her feelings and channeling her artistic ways without interference. Common subjects were Southern women, dancers and performers, biblical scenes, and domestic or pastoral settings. Despite using lively colors, many scholars point out an undercurrent of confinement. Figures look posed, contained, or emotionally distant. You can definitely see her Southern upbringing and her longing for order after years of chaos. Unlike her writing, her paintings actually received some encouragement. Scott arranged her first exhibition with 13 paintings and 15 drawings. Reviews were mixed, but genuinely kinder than those for her novel or her play. In this time, Scott moved between New York and Hollywood while Zelda was hospitalized. Scott visited, wrote, worried, and paid the bills. But he also stayed away for long periods, building another life. He even tried to rekindle with his first love, Ginevra King, and eventually settled into a relationship with Sheila Graham. Their correspondence remained complex and tender. Scott worried about her health, and Zelda worried about his drinking. There was bitterness, but also a familiarity so deep it never turned cold. Zelda made some progress, so she was discharged into her mother's care at nearly 40 years old. The couple made plans to meet again in December 1940, but fate didn't allow them this reunion, sadly. Scott died of an unexpected heart attack at the age of 44. And of course, Zelda's grief was profound. Her identity had been so closely tied to him. And I think, looking past the fights and the toxicity, they did deeply care about each other. In one final act of love, she read his unfinished manuscript, The Love of the Last Tycoon, and sent it off to a friend to be edited. While being in and out of the hospital again, she even started writing a novel, The Caesar's Things. Sadly, she didn't get any better mentally. or even finished a novel. A sign of her failing mental health can be seen in the fact that she missed both Scott's funeral and her daughter's Scotty wedding. 10 years of electroshock therapy and insulin shock treatment contributed to her memory loss and apathetic personality. I had no idea what insulin shock treatment was, so if you've never heard of it either, patients were injected with large doses of insulin to deliberately lower their blood sugar. The goal was a temporary coma, sometimes multiple times a week. After the coma, patients were carefully revived with sugar or glucose. It was believed that inducing comas could reset the brain, relieving symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, or catatonia. Some psychiatrists reported short-term improvements in mood, thought patterns, or behavior, though these were unreliable and inconsistent. Surprise, surprise. Obvious risks and side effects are seizures, brain damage from the repeated hypoglycemia, severe fatigue, confusion, or memory loss, and even death in some cases. And luckily, it stopped being used around the 1950s due to these side effects. In the night of March 10, 1948, Zelda was sedated and locked in a room of the 5th floor of the facility she was staying in, possibly awaiting shock therapy. A fire broke out in the hospital kitchen. It quickly moved through the dumbwaiter shaft, spreading onto every floor. 9 women, including Zelda, died that night. There are rumors that it was arson by an hospital employee. Zelda and Scott were buried together in Maryland. Zelda grew up privileged, living underneath the umbrella of her father's name and wealth. She had a brilliant mind and a beautiful appearance, but this did not protect her from mental illness. She started struggling so early, and I feel so deeply for the fact that she tried to create something for herself all throughout her life, but kept getting rejected. She lived underneath her husband's shadow and never had the means to make a name for herself, either always being known for Scott or being belittled for her declining mental health. She inspired Scott's early success, shaping his female characters, his dialogue, and even the image of the jazz-age couple that made him famous. He depended on her energy to fuel his work. As time went on, his admiration turned into competition. Scott believed himself to be the real artist, downplaying Zelda's artistic capabilities. Despite supporting her ballet career or her art exhibition, his support always kind of appears conditional. He celebrated Zelda when her creativity reflected well on him, but when it became independent or competitive, it was a problem. Her mental illness complicated everything. He switched between concern and resentment. He acted as her caretaker, but also blamed her illness for his declining career, financial stress, and personal failures. I think that's a very complex situation to judge. He stayed in her life and made sure to pay all the bills so that people would take care of her. I mean, today we have a better understanding of mental illness, but still, if you experience mental struggles or someone in your life who's struggling, it can be a very difficult situation to deal with. Taking care of yourself or caring for someone else can be very draining and emotionally exhausting. So, looking back, it must have been even harder in those days for both of them for very different reasons. Also, looking at the different forms of therapy which we use, I cannot believe what it would be like to be exposed to shock therapy or insulin therapy multiple times a week. Zelda threw herself into everything with an extreme intensity. She wrote, danced, and drew, sometimes in manic ways, maybe trying to find a way to escape herself. Both Scott and Zelda weren't villains or victims in simple ways. Their relationship shows love, ambition, illness, and gender expectations collided in a time that gave women very little space to be artists on their own terms. Zelda's story is not simply one of tragedy. It is also one of resilience, passion, and the relentless pursuit of a voice that refused to be silenced. In the end, her life and work continue to inspire, reminding us that creativity and identity are inseparable, even when constrained by circumstance.